7 months ago, I didn't even know what surface pattern design was, but I've made dozens of patterns since then, so I figured it was about time to do a bit of a pattern roundup and show you kind of all the progress that I've made as a pattern designer over the past 7 months. So if you're new here, hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm a surface pattern designer by night and an environmental scientist by day. And on this channel, we talk about all things watercolor, surface pattern design, and creative entrepreneurship. And so today, I'm going to take you way back to my very first patterns and just kind of walk you through the progress that I've made and some of the big milestones that I've had in the 8 months that I've been designing patterns. Okay, so I'm going to jump all the way back to the beginning. And I first encountered surface pattern design through an Instagram ad. And I think there's a lot of people who have had a similar experience where I actually found Bonnie Christine's Instagram ad for a free mini course she was doing. And I know there are lots of others who are in the same boat. And I'm honestly eternally grateful to Bonnie for running those ads because I would have had no clue that this whole industry existed had she not done that. So thank you, Bonnie, for doing that. I love it. So anyway, Bonnie taught this 5-day course that was just a really high-level introduction to how to create your own patterns. And I took it and I made my very first pattern, and I'm gonna show it to you now, and it's embarrassing and a little cringy. So anyway, here we go. This is my very first pattern that I ever made. And listen, it's not cute. It's a little funky, got some weird colors, but it repeats. And I remember when I first made this pattern, I thought all of those things, but I also thought, wow, this is really magical. Like, this is wild that I took my artwork, which was Bonnie has you like paint some black watercolor on, it's just a piece of paper, so it was nothing fancy. Maybe I had like taken a Sharpie and done some leaves too or something like that. I don't even remember. But I took my artwork that was in the real world, I digitized it and vectorized it and turned it into a pattern, which was so wild. And so I was instantly hooked. Even though this pattern was not very cute, I was like, wow, this is pretty crazy. So I jumped into making immediately another pattern on that same day, and here is that second pattern. And honestly, I think the difference between the first pattern and the second pattern is like pretty substantial. I think you can see already in my second pattern, I was thinking about things like changing the scale of my different motifs and kind of layering. Like I had those leaves that are in the background of that second pattern. I still use that same kind of funky color palette. It's a little bit weird. I took that from a photo of a flower that I had taken and I pulled some colors. If I were to do this pattern again, I think I would think a little bit more carefully about which colors I was pulling from that flower, because this particular color combination is a little bit wild. Not necessarily something I would go for now, but overall, I think it's a huge jump between, pattern number 1 and pattern number 2. So a few days later, I just like kept the ball rolling with these patterns, and I made this little tea time pattern. So I painted with some gouache a few like elements that are related to tea, and I vectorized them and used those same techniques to turn them into this pattern here. And so again, I think it's a big jump from those original patterns to this one. I remember when I made this one, I was actually kind of excited about the idea of vectorizing your art, which if you have been watching my other videos or if you follow me on Instagram, you know I don't really vectorize my art anymore. I work in rasters, I work in Photoshop, but we'll get there in a minute. But anyway, I remember seeing my gouache paintings vectorized. I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. They do look very like graphic and different, but they also look a lot different from the actual paintings that I have in the real world. But regardless, I thought that this was a better use of color. It's a little bit more balanced. I still have those like little filler elements, but this repeat is very easy to spot. And that's okay. That's not the end of the world for sure, but it was another great stepping stone. Okay, continuing on from that very first month, I also put together these ice cream patterns here. And these I remember being super excited about. Okay, so let me show you the very first ice cream pattern that I put together. This one is a really simple, kind of the most basic half drop you could possibly have, but I was like, all right, this is kind of cute, this is getting somewhere. And then let me show you the more kind of intricate, more complicated version. And this one I was very excited about. I was like, okay, now we're getting somewhere. So now this is feeling more like this vision that I have in my mind of, how my artwork is gonna look in patterns. And I was super excited about this one. And I also made like a little coordinating sprinkles pattern with some of the sprinkles I had painted so that this would all kind of go together as a cohesive thing. And I actually, for the very first time, I ordered this on Fabric, and so I'll show you a little video of when I received that. And this was pretty awesome because I had never seen my artwork on a product before. And don't get me wrong, like, I had this experience of, okay, the sizing, I got it all wrong. This is not right. They are giant cones of ice cream. They were meant to be like little tiny and dainty and cute, and that I totally messed that up. Same with the sprinkles. They were giant, but nonetheless, I was so excited to see it like out in the real world. I thought this was the coolest experience ever. And this was all within my first month of pattern designing. So looking back at it now, I am pretty impressed with just like the change from pattern number 1 to that pattern number, I guess, 3, 4, 5, whatever. These ice cream patterns. It was my like 3rd pattern session that I sat down to do. Okay, so now we're moving on to my 2nd month of pattern making. So I started this month with a whole series of like breads and pastries that I had painted. Now I used gouache to paint these, and I learned a lot in trying to put together patterns from these. So here are the original paintings that I made, and I really liked painting them because they were fun and they were realistic, and I liked the way they turned out, especially those baguettes. But when I put them into patterns, I didn't like it at all. And let me show you the patterns here. I used Adobe Illustrator again because that's all I had used prior to that, and it was just not working. First of all, vectorizing these were not meant to be vectored. I can see that now. They just don't work great for vectorizing. And I think beyond that, they're not great for patterns in general because I think, at least for me, for the style that I'm going for, they were a little bit too much on the realism side, to the point where they looked a little bit awkward, I felt like, on patterns. Like, when I saw these patterns put together, I thought, okay, I feel like these need to be flatter. Like, they need to have a little bit less dimension. I kind of liked the way the baguette one was going, where it was, like, very simple, and just that like mix of different baguettes that we have on there. A little bit harder to spot the repeat on that one than in some of my previous patterns, so that was cool. And with the pastry one, I didn't quite get the repeat right. You can see there's a straight line kind of down the middle, but again, there's like some potential there, but it wasn't quite what I had in mind. These were feeling, again, a little bit too realistic, a little bit too three-dimensional for what I wanted to see. Also, within this 2nd month, I had this whole saga of giraffe patterns, and this was a huge learning moment for me too. So with these giraffe patterns, I started them actually with a hand-drawn repeat, and so that literally means I took a piece of paper and I tiled it so that the actual piece of paper can be repeated. And then I took that hand-drawn sketch and I brought that into Adobe Illustrator. And I played with a couple different techniques with this. First, I vectorized the actual sketch, and it's a kind of interesting pattern that it turned out. And looking back at it now, it's actually not bad. Like, I remember not liking it at all when I put it together, but looking at it now, it's kind of interesting. It's not really like anything I'm doing these days. It's kind of very outside of my signature style that I've been developing, but interesting nonetheless. Now then, I took this same sketch and I tried a different kind of vectorizing technique where I colored in all of the motifs myself. This was from a Skillshare class that I took by Mel Armstrong. I love her, by the way. She's awesome, and if you're on Skillshare, totally recommend taking her classes. So again, I think this Mel Armstrong technique pattern turned out interesting, but I don't love it, and I didn't love it at the time either. I think I learned a lot about the techniques that you can actually use in Adobe Illustrator. I try to add little details on like the tree trunk and the leaves and things like that. And so I think there's potential here, but it just wasn't really what I had in mind. I had a vision for some of my patterns and I was not achieving it in Illustrator. And so what I did is I actually painted some of these giraffes using watercolor back to the medium that I was a bit more familiar with. And I was like, all right, there's got to be a way to do this not using vectors, because I felt like I was fighting with the vectors to get them to do exactly what I had in mind. And I started playing with the idea of creating patterns in Photoshop. So at this stage, I had no idea what I was doing, and I feel like I think I cobbled it together with like random YouTube tutorials and stuff like that. But here's the Photoshop rasterized giraffe pattern I put together. And when I did this was the first time where I was like, oh baby, we're getting somewhere, because this was so much more aligned with like the vision I had in mind for what I wanted my patterns to look like. It really maintained that hand painted watercolor kind of loose and messy feeling. It didn't have that weird three-dimensional aspect that those breads and pastries had, but it was flat and much looser, and I liked it a lot. So this one was a bit of a game changer for me, and as you'll see, this kind of carried forward in the patterns that I made from that point on. All right, month 3 was another big month for me, and I feel like every month is kind of like that at the very beginning, but truly this one was a big game changer for me. So I put together a few jellyfish related patterns in month number 3. Okay, so I started with these original kind of jellyfish that I painted, and I thought they were interesting. I used a pretty limited color palette, so I used like 3 or 4 colors for these, and I just kind of made them up. And so I thought they would be interesting candidates for patterns, and I was really excited to pull them into Photoshop. I used similar techniques that I did for the giraffes, but when I put together these patterns, I realized that they didn't have a lot of movement. So you can see these jellyfish were pretty stiff, like pretty rigid and up and down. And I was like, this feels weird because jellyfish are like the most loose and flowy animals that I could imagine, and I've painted them such that they look very like stiff. So I was like, all right, I can learn from this that, you know, I like the painting technique I use. The colors are kind of interesting. And like, for example, this dark pattern that I made with the dark background and the jellyfish, there's some potential there. Like, I think that was kind of interesting to use that dark background. But I was like, all right, we got to do something about these stiff jellies. So I went back to the drawing board and I painted some other jellyfish. And you can see here that these have a lot more movement, a lot more flow. And I knew from the moment that I painted these that they have a lot more potential in a pattern. Now, after I painted these, I actually took another Skillshare class, and this one is by Kat Cocolette, and it was a game changer for me. Like, seriously, I have talked about this before, but like I was sitting on this couch and I was watching this Skillshare class, and like every couple of minutes I was taking out my AirPods and turning to my partner, and I was like, this person is changing my life right now. Like, this is crazy. These techniques were amazing, and they were just opening up a world of possibilities for me. It was such an exciting day to do this. And so after I took that class, I put together a whole bunch of different colorways for these jellies. And so here's the original one, and then I have just tons of other colorways. As part of Kat's class, she also teaches you how to use like these glittery backgrounds, so I did a few of those, and it was just so awesome. And I don't use all of the techniques that I learned in this class now, but I certainly use a lot of them, and it was just a huge game changer for me to be able to see the potential that a Photoshop raster pattern could have. And so these jellies were really the first time that I like loved a pattern that I made. Okay, in month 4, I started to get into a flow with this Photoshop thing, but I also did some experimental types of things. So the first pattern I made in this month was this vegetable garden, and this was for my very first Spoonflower challenge. I don't do these all the time anymore, but this was a fun one. The prompt was called garden bedding, and so the idea was to create bedding, like a duvet cover, that had something to do with a garden. And so I took inspiration from some of the vegetables that I have grown before in my vegetable garden, and I painted them again using gouache and a relatively limited color palette. Again, I stuck to 6 colors for this one, and I pulled together this pattern in Photoshop, and I was super proud of the way it turned out. Now, I did share it online, and immediately someone responded and was like, it's a cute pattern, but sewists would really appreciate if you make things that are non-directional, or at least bi-directional, because this is a very one-directional pattern, right? It only goes up and down, and when you're sewing, it does make a lot of sense that it's easier if you don't have to think about which way your fabric is pointing. So that was good feedback, but regardless, I really like the way this pattern turned out. I also put together some orcas that I'm not as much of a fan of because they fell more into that rigid group for me. I don't think that they turned out exactly the way that I had in mind, so who knows, maybe one of these days I'll revisit the orcas, but you know, they happened. And then I did some experimental things. So for another Spoonflower challenge, I put together these rosy maple moths, and these were using vectors again. So you'll see, you know, I had kind of stopped doing vectors, but I needed to use very specific specific colors, and so I did that using vectors. I've since learned there are ways to do that in Photoshop using your rasters as well, so I'm going to do that some more going forward, but these were a fun experiment anyway. And then I also experimented with these abstract patterns, which I've been playing with a lot more, but this blew my mind. I found somebody on Instagram. You can find her on Instagram at MJM Studio. Her name is Jacqueline, and she creates these patterns that are very like abstract-y and blobby, and really what I was drawn to and what I was hooked by is that I couldn't tell where her patterns like started and ended, meaning they weren't always isolated individual motifs. Like all of her motifs kind of touched each other, and I was like, what? You can do that? Like I had no idea. And so I played with this a lot more during this month, and I was able to figure out how to, create these abstract blobby patterns where your motifs aren't completely isolated. And I love it. So you'll see I've done a few more of this kind of vibe patterns over the past few months. So moving on to month number 5, I did a couple more patterns that were related to Spoonflower challenges. So first, here's these betta fish that I put together. And so this is a pretty fun pattern. I've had a few people reach out to me saying they really love the way that this one turned out. The Spoonflower challenge was called Abstract Animal Prints, which this one really doesn't fit that brief. It's not an animal print, and it's also not abstract, but I was really stumped and kept trying a bunch of different things that didn't work. But this is what I landed on, and regardless of whether it fits the brief or not, I actually really like the way that this pattern turned out as well. It's so colorful, it's so fun, it does have a little bit more movement in it than you remember those like stiff jellyfish. And I really just love the way it turned out. Now, I think there are some specific uses for this. Like, I keep envisioning, like, if I had this on a shower curtain, I think that would be so awesome. But, you know, I don't know that it's necessarily the kind of thing that I would want on, like, my bedspread or something like that. But who knows? Maybe someone would like it like that. I also put together in this month a very simple little pattern for another Spoonflower challenge. And the challenge was called, like, dollhouse wallpaper or something like that. And the idea was to make, like, a dainty little dollhouse wallpaper. And so this I came up with in like not very much time at all. Like it took me, I don't know, half an hour to paint this and then another hour to put the pattern together, which for me that's very fast. And I wasn't sure how it would turn out, but I like how it turned out. I think it's simple and nice, and yeah, I'm a big fan. Alright, so now we're in month number 6. So this is my half-year mark of making patterns, and this is another game changer month for me because I made my favorite pattern that I had ever made, and that is this orange pattern. Specifically this pattern with the dark background, but I also made it with this cream background and a lighter blue background, and I loved this pattern. I still love this pattern, and honestly, this one has been I think it would be my most popular pattern too, based on the response of people on my Instagram page, for example, and on my Spoonflower shop. I just loved the kind of balance of this one and the bright colors of the oranges and the flowers and the leaves, and I just really love how it turned out. Now, I created some other patterns this month as well that I actually also really love. So these mushrooms that I put together were a very cool experiment for me because I painted them using my left hand. So I actually originally did this in solidarity with my friend who we were roller skating together, and she broke her wrist of her dominant hand. And so after she had fallen, we were painting together, but she couldn't use her dominant hand to paint. So she was using her non-dominant hand. And I was like, all right, you know what? I'll do it with you. And I painted these mushrooms and I loved them. I loved how like messy and wobbly and wiggly they looked, and I was totally hooked with this technique. But anyway, this mushroom pattern turned out so fun and funky and weird, and I made it in a couple different colorways too. I also put together some more abstracts. This is nothing new really, but with that similar technique that I had developed in a previous month. And also worth mentioning in this month is that this is the first time that I was able to open up my Spoonflower shop. So I collectively put in a bunch of the patterns that I had made in the previous months, and I ordered some filler yards on Spoonflower, and so now a bunch of those patterns are available for sale, which is really fun. It's really cool to see my actual patterns on actual fabric, and so that was another big game changer for me. And that brings us to month number 7, which is actually the month that I'm in right now. I'm on the last day of month 7. So that brings us to the present. To start this month, I started by using some more of that left-handed technique that I had used for those mushrooms to put together a whole bunch of fruit patterns. Some of them didn't make it all the way to the pattern stage because I didn't love the way that the paintings were looking, but I did put together a couple, like this strawberry pattern, which I did in a few colorways. And I also put together the beginnings of this lemon pattern, I don't love where that one is quite yet, so I'm gonna go back to it and redo that one. But you know, those are a couple patterns that I put together, and I wanted to document that like not everyone is a winner, and that's okay. They're not all gonna be amazing. But I was really riding the high after that orange pattern. Now I also put together this banana pattern, and I did really like the way that this one turned out. So much so that when I saw it, I said, okay, I'm gonna take this one a little bit further, and I'm gonna move it into my very first mini collection. So you'll see that all of my previous patterns were kind of one-offs. I didn't really do them with much of a collection kind of mindset, but with this one I was like, okay, let's see where we can go with this, because at the same time I'm in the process of putting it together a portfolio, something that I can send out to companies and like pitch my artwork to. And as part of this, I started to think about like how my patterns are going to sit together, how they're going to be coherent, what kind of story they're going to tell. And so I was like, all right, banana pattern, you are candidate number one. Let's see where this goes. And so I did put together this little collection. I actually vlogged the whole process of putting together this little mini collection. So if you are interested in seeing more behind the scenes of that, I will put a link to that video. But anyway, I really like those simple patterns that I put together. And that was also kind of a game changer for me, is like when I painted these simple little motifs and I pulled them into Photoshop and I was able to put together a pattern in like 5 minutes, my mind was blown a little bit, because I am definitely in the like slow designer camp. It takes me a while to do some of these things, but these simple little patterns were amazing how quick they came together. So that was fun, and I really like the way that this little mini collection kind of sits together. And obviously I've stuck with a very monochrome look for this one, and I think for me, as someone who's still, I would say, in the beginner phases, sticking to a really limited color palette is a great way to tell a very consistent color story. So after I put together those banana patterns, I had this idea to put together 3 mini collections that are like monochrome primaries. So I have the yellows with the banana. So right now I'm putting together a blue little mini collection, and then I'll be doing a red one after that. So for this blue mini collection, I guess my hero print that I put together are these florals. So this one's kind of fun. It's not as monochrome as the banana one, but still it's certainly very blue dominant. And I put together a few different backgrounds for this, different colorways. And while I think that the white background probably goes best with the bananas, I am personally kind of partial towards this dark background. I really like the way that it looks. Now on top of this hero print, I've started to put together a bunch of those simpler blenders and coordinates, and those are pretty fun too. So like I said, I'm not like done with these yet. This is something I'm still in the process of, but they're coming together. And I'm also getting a lot faster with this whole process, to the point where like for this little mini blue collection, I've put together 4 different colorways. Now this is not something that will necessarily go in my portfolio, but like on my Spoonflower shop, for example, they'll sit happily there. So that brings me to today. So I would love to hear your thoughts about, do you have a favorite pattern of all the different patterns that I've put together so far? As I mentioned before, many of these are available in my Spoonflower shop. So if you are interested in having any of these patterns on a bunch of different types of fabrics, or on wallpaper, or on home decor, I'll leave a link to my Spoonflower shop below. You can find me there and everywhere else at Peppo Studios. Now I'm about to start month number 8, so I'm very excited to see what comes next. My head is seriously so full of ideas. It's a very exciting feeling, you know, to be so motivated and to be so excited about this whole pattern making process that I've kind of jumped into. But I am really excited to see where it goes. And if you are also interested to see how this progresses for me, I welcome you to subscribe to my channel. I'm trying to post every week or so, and I'll keep you in the loop with everything I'm doing with regards to building my patterns and also building my business. So with that, thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you very soon for the next one. Take care, everyone. Before I go, let me show you guys who's with me. So Pumpkin says, bye everybody. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, can you give it a like? And if you're not subscribed already, Pumpkin and I would love it if you would join us for this journey. Alright, take care everybody.